Another concept we need to discuss is asymmetry in the face, which as a digital modeler, if I'm honest, I think it sucks because I love symmetry. I love having the ability to get the other half of whatever I'm building for free. It's such a convenient way to work. But the reality is the vast majority of human faces are asymmetrical to some degree. And if we're pursuing maximum realism for our portraits, we need to be mindful of this fact. And so here I've got Krita open, which is an open source alternative to Photoshop, a very good one in my opinion. And this document I'm going to share in the source files because it's a good exercise for analyzing asymmetry in faces. And we're going to begin with my own face. Because in my earlier days of portrait creation, when I first heard that faces have asymmetry, I was a little skeptical. I think I assumed that most people's faces were symmetrical by nature. And I also didn't want to believe it because, again, I love working with symmetry. And so it wasn't until I performed this test on my own face that the reality really hit home. And so I think that's a good place to start. So the idea here is we want to take a photograph of a head straight on with fairly consistent lighting, if possible, on each side of the head. And we also want to orient it so that it's straight up and down on the canvas. You can test that by dragging out a guide and making sure that the straight vertical line crosses the middle of the mouth and the middle of the nose and the middle of the forehead. And once we have that oriented properly, the exercise is pretty simple. We're going to select one half of the face. It doesn't really matter which side. Control C and Control V. And then Control T will enable our transform tool. I can right click and choose mirror horizontal and then shift and move to the right. Shift will keep it only moving horizontally and stationary vertically. Okay, so I'm going to place it roughly in the center, and then you can test this if I lower the opacity. You can sort of align, especially the nostril with the underlying nostril. Looks like I got off my vertical axis a bit, so let's try that again. Okay, that's actually pretty close. The nostril and mouth line up pretty well, but the ear and cheek don't, and the eye doesn't really either. So to make this test a little bit more fair, I'm going to try and make this half line up with the underlying features as best as possible. So since the mouth is good, I'm going to rotate from that axis, and then I can see my iris come into alignment as well as the ear, although I might need to scale out a little bit for the ear. Okay, so now I think I've aligned it as symmetrically as possible. At this point, we can turn opacity back up to 100 and see a symmetrical version of my head. And maybe to you, it doesn't look like that big of a difference, but since I am the most familiar with my head than anyone else on the planet, I know that this is just a little bit off. This isn't quite me. And it's that feeling that really solidified the reality of asymmetry in our faces for me. And so one other thing I like to do to make it a fair test as possible is to add a transparency mask, which I can do by right-clicking on the layer. And then with a soft brush and the color black, I'm just going to paint out the harsh line of symmetry down the center. Okay, we're left with a pretty dark kind of strip down the middle, and this is due to lighting inconsistency. Obviously, one side of the face is lit much more than the other, so we can try to ignore that, but with that at least blurred, we get a better test of symmetry. And here we can start to turn it on and off, the second layer. And now is where we really notice what parts of the face are different. My eye is immediately drawn to my mouth. Note how the left side of my mouth is naturally angled upward compared to the right side of my mouth. And whenever we turn it symmetrical, that becomes very apparent. The nostril is pretty much symmetrical, though if we really study it, the contours do shift a little bit. Also, the eye shifts around a bit too. The superior palpebral fold on the top, the inside contour kind of raises up and the outside dips down if we turn that on and off. Also, the caruncle, I think, shifts up slightly. And the brow shifts around a little bit, but it's fairly symmetrical, maybe raises up a little bit on the outside corner. And then the ear and silhouette of the head, I'm not too worried about because I know we can't know for sure if the photograph was taken exactly head on. So there could be some perspective shifting, but really the eye, mouth, and nose is where the asymmetry makes itself apparent. And so if I were sculpting my own head, I would want to introduce asymmetry into the sculpture Also in terms of texture and hair. Obviously, it looks really weird that my hair would be symmetrical. That is almost always noticeably asymmetrical on everybody's head unless they're bald. But also there's some, skin things like moles, for example. It's going to be very obvious if that is symmetrical, so that the texture needs to be asymmetrical. And now that I'm looking at it, my neck as a whole kind of leans to one side. It's kind of interesting to study your face this way. But definitely a good exercise, and I think it would be great if you did it as well. Just take a photo with your phone, put it in this document, make sure it aligns vertically, and do the flip test. I think it's extremely informative and kind of fun too. But obviously, we are most aware of our own faces. But what if we test people that we don't know? Also in this document, I have a few other heads that are great candidates for a flip test. This one is awesome because the lighting is almost identical on both sides. Also, it looks pretty much dead straight at the camera. So if we do the same flip test and turn that on and off, this head kind of passes as symmetrical. Now, I would guess that part of it is I don't know this person, and so I'm not that intimately familiar with their likeness. And so I can accept a symmetrical version pretty easily. But, if we flip on and off, you're always going to see subtle differences, like the nostril seems to flare out a bit. The lips and their contours subtly change. The volume seems to be a little bit different depending on which side you're looking at. The eye shifts a little bit, though some of it could be perspective. And obviously the ear is probably the biggest difference, which also might be perspective, but it seems to kind of hug the side of the head a little bit more when it's symmetrical. But in my experience, this confirms that we could leave the head symmetrical if we wanted, at least the head sculpture or model, and kind of get away with it staying symmetrical. And that's what I do a lot of times, especially if I'm doing a head that isn't recognizable. It's not a celebrity or a historical figure or myself, right? So if it's just an amalgamation using several references like we've done throughout this chapter, then I can be okay leaving it symmetrical. I have a few other tests if you want to run through them, all of which are good examples of symmetry with consistent lighting. You can obviously see how the eye is shifting. There are unique differences to each side, the mouth and the eye. In fact, those two are the most important. Changes to the eye, changes to the mouth, I think have the most consequence, followed behind by the nose. But the ear and overall head silhouette, I don't think is that noticeable in the grand scheme of things. There's also, I think, a female here who has different lighting, but still the test, I think, holds true. Her lips are almost completely symmetrical, just the slightest contour difference on the bottom lip. If we flip that back and forth, but the upper lip is almost completely symmetrical. The nose almost completely symmetrical, though the eye does shift its shape and position a little bit, which is interesting. But all of these cases of people that I don't know, I think they offered reasonable evidence that we can leave the face symmetrical. The model specifically, I think we always need to make the hair asymmetrical and the texture asymmetrical at the very least. However, the last test is of someone we all should recognize. All right, so this covers the case of celebrity or historical figure where asymmetry does become much more important. Now, it shouldn't take you more than 5 to 10 seconds to start noticing asymmetry without even doing the flip test. All right, so as I look at Abe, the upper half of the head looks pretty symmetrical. Nothing I can notice from the naked eye, but the bottom half, for one, he's got either a mole or some sort of skin feature that is not on the left side of the face. And so this is a geometric difference. It's not just texture. So we want to include that if we were to sculpt it or model it. And the more you kind of stare at this point, this kind of pulls the cheek down seemingly. And then our eye goes to the mouth, and there's some major differences in here. For one, the entire bottom lip seems to slide towards the right side. If you can see my head, that being an exaggerated version. And so it makes the right side of the upper lip kind of shrink in its size, noticeably from the left side. And so this is crucial to the likeness of Abraham Lincoln. And if we perform the symmetry test, I think there is bigger consequence to leaving this symmetrical. You know, if we were to show your average person, I think they would still guess that, yeah, that looks like Abraham Lincoln. But that's kind of a failure response when you're trying to nail a likeness. You want someone to say, wait, that's not a photograph, right? In other words, that is definitely Abraham Lincoln, but in this case, the symmetry ruins that likeness a bit. The lips are extremely different as we flip back and forth. And so the point being that if you're working toward a likeness, then asymmetry becomes much more important, and you want to seriously consider introducing it into the sculpture or model. And so from here, let's jump back into Blender and talk about how we accomplish asymmetry. As far as implementing asymmetry into our sculpture, it's extremely easy. As you can imagine, based on the analysis we just went over, asymmetrical differences are very subtle. And so in the matter of 30 seconds to 60 seconds, we can have reasonable asymmetry implemented, especially in the case of a generic head like this one. And I think I will add asymmetry as a shape key like we've been adding contexts. So I'll add a new shape key and call it asymmetry. Push it up to value 1 and jump into sculpt mode. And we want to turn off X symmetry, and really with my grab tool, I'll simply pull up one side. I'm going to focus my asymmetrical changes only on one side of the head. So if we pull up this lip, maybe bring down Cupid's bow on one side, bring down the lower contour of the lip, and then let's see, push the nose a little bit to one side. A lot of people have crooked noses. Flare out one nostril. All these kinds of small changes that we saw in the flip tests. And then lastly, I think will be our eye. I don't know, maybe I'll change the ear a little bit. And I'm just going to slightly tweak sort of the slant of the eye. So bring down the outside corner, bring up the caruncle, bring up the bottom eyelid. Same thing with the brow, just very subtle changes. You probably aren't even able to see how subtle these changes are. But if we turn it on and off, we can see the difference. And this is the same kind of changes we saw in our flip tests. And in fact, you might be thinking this has been kind of a long video for such a profoundly simple change. And this is kind of where I draw a distinction between demonstrating the concept and talking about workflow. Because honestly, I never implement asymmetry at this sculpting stage because sculpting is just the first of many steps in a portrait creation process. And so if I commit to asymmetry this early on, that means I commit to it for retopology and for detail sculpting. So I like to hold off the commitment as long as possible. And again, since this is a generic head, I really think in a workflow sense, we could continue with a symmetrical version. So really the only time I commit to asymmetry at this sculpting stage is when I'm sculpting someone like Abraham Lincoln. I really want the likeness to be achieved as early as possible. And so I will commit to asymmetry in the sculpture as I have here. And if asymmetry and where it belongs in the workflow isn't completely clear to you now, don't worry, we're going to come back to it in subsequent chapters. But really what I want you to leave this video with is understanding that asymmetry is an important part of realistic portraits. And even this little bit that we added to our default sculpture, initially it might feel weird because we're so used to seeing the symmetrical version. But remember the tests, remember the fact of asymmetry, and I already feel like this person looks more natural, more believable. So yeah, it's very good to be aware of asymmetry in the face.